God is right here, right now.
No matter what your faith,
all phenomena have natural explanations. There is no supernatural.
Or what you believe.
The human longing is for meaning.
How each of us understands the meaning of life comes down to one ultimate question. Does God really exist?
A part of us yearns for a relationship with the source of all love and joy and hope. And another part that raises its fist in defiance.
For more than 30 years, Dr. Armand Nicolai has taught a popular course at Harvard on the question of God. His text,
Wake up.
the writings of two of the most profound thinkers of the 20th century, C.S. Lewis and Sigmund Freud.
Arguably, Freud is the most influential spokesman for the secular worldview.
Religion is the universal, obsessional neurosis of humanity.
And Lewis, the most influential spokesman for the spiritual worldview.
I believe in God, as I believe the sun has risen, not because I can see it, but because by way of it, I can see everything else.
This is the story of two men with very different ideas of human existence.
Freud and Lewis represent conflicting parts of ourselves. Whatever part we choose will determine our purpose, our identity, and our whole philosophy of life.
Tonight, take an emotional and intellectual journey into the lives and minds of these two giants as they try to unravel the meaning of life in The Question of God.
Funding for this program was provided by Lawrence Rockefeller, the John Templeton Foundation, the Arthur Vining Davis Foundation, the Paul Montrone Foundation, Tom and Gert Phillips, the ServiceMaster Company. Funding is also provided by these funders: This program was also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station by viewers like you. Thank you.
All over the world, people are asking the same questions. What does it mean to love your neighbor? Why is there so much pain and suffering in the world? What does it take to be a moral person? Is there a God? A man who has spent his life exploring these questions is Dr. Armand Nicolai, a Harvard University professor and practicing psychiatrist. His lectures, seminars, and book, The Question of God, draw on the lives of Sigmund Freud, the founder of Psychoanalysis and an atheist, and C.S. Lewis, the most influential voice of faith in our time.
Why Freud and Lewis? Well, few individuals have influenced the moral fabric of contemporary Western civilization more than Sigmund Freud and C.S. Lewis.
We mortals have a root in the absolute. We yearn for that unity which we can never reach except by ceasing to be separate beings called we.
Well, see, that's why...
In Dr. Nicolai's seminar, C.S. Lewis the believer and Sigmund Freud the atheist are brought together in debate.
And some days I don't believe so much.
It has been my life's work to show man that his beliefs and his behavior are rooted not in divine truth, but in his own childhood fears and desires.
So it
Yeah, but I wanted to ask Michael
For this
one other
series,
thing, because I'm just
Dr.
curious
Nicolai
about
invited a
issues
panel
talked
of
about
7
theism,
thoughtful
atheism.
men and women to grapple with the fundamental riddle of our existence.
Whether we realize it or not, all of us possess a worldview. we make one of two basic assumptions. We view the universe as an accident, or we assume an intelligence beyond the universe who gives the universe order, and for some of us, meaning to life.
To me, there is an order for the way things are, and the central question is whether you want to say that the orderer is God. That's another thing.
Can I jump in for a second?
Sure.
I think that order doesn't necessarily mean intelligence, right. And intelligence, consciousness.
Throughout the series, we will move from their debate into episodes from the lives of Freud and Lewis. The panel will discuss issues of faith and doubt in their own lives.
A large part of me, at many times, for a lot of reasons, has wanted to not believe, because it would be so much easier in many ways.
The question is, I think, for me anyway, to what extent can somebody foist their beliefs on others or claim that their beliefs are true and that your beliefs are false?
Right. Well, that's a real, that
true for you or true for all?
I have experienced God, and I can talk from my experience, and I can trust, as you say, and I have surrendered to that trust.
Naturalism is my philosophy, that all phenomena have natural explanations. There is no supernatural. There's just the natural and stuff we can't yet explain.
We're all betting on something, and we have incomplete information to place that bet.
Ever since I've been a little girl, I've had very powerful experiences of God's presence.
Let's look at these early life experiences as they occurred in Lewis's and Freud's lives.
The man who would become an atheist was raised in a world steeped in religious belief. His home was a small town where, like so many towns in the 19th century in Eastern Europe, a community of Jews lived among a majority of Catholics.
It is not easy to recall those early days. Only a few fragments reach into my memory. But of one thing I am certain. Deep within me there continues to live the happy child from Freiburg, the son of a youthful mother, the boy who received from this air, from this soil, the first indelible impressions.
The Freuds were a traditional Jewish family who lived in Freiburg, a distant outpost of the Austrian Empire. There, Jacob Freud traded in the wool business. Twice a widower when he met Amalia, they were married and had their first son in 1856. The young mother doted on the boy she called her golden child.
I have found that people who know they are favored by their mother give evidence in their lives of an unshakable optimism, which often seems like heroic attributes and brings actual success to their possessors.
For Sigmund, as for everyone at that time, religion, education, and family were woven together.
I was still a young boy when my father started to teach me to read, using the Bible to instruct me in both German and a Hebrew of our ancestors.
Freud had a very close relationship with his father. He was home instructed, probably till almost the age of 9. And as he wrote later, Freud became very immersed in the Bible and in studies of the Bible. He identified with significant figures in the Bible. I'll just mention two that were very important. One was Joseph, who interpreted the Pharaoh's dreams, and Freud later became the interpreter of dreams. The other one was Moses, a very powerful identification with Moses. I think he saw himself as a kind of modern Moses, bringing a new understanding to humanity.
The young Sigmund felt the strong emotion of faith from his nursemaid, a devout Catholic.
My nanny was an elderly but clever woman from the town who told me a great deal about God Almighty and hell. She took me to church. When I got home, I would preach and tell my family what God Almighty does.
He lost the nanny abruptly. He was told that she was caught stealing, supposedly from him, a story that to me is not believable. Something else must have happened, but we don't know what. The story he was told is that she was sent to jail for 10 months. He was quite desperate about her disappearance. He turned to his father as someone to help him and be with him, replacing the companionship, affection that the nurse had provided for him. However, catastrophe happened once more.
The branch of industry in which my father was concerned collapsed. He lost all his means, and we were forced to leave Freiberg and move to Vienna.
So they changed from this little town in which they had a comfortable, good enough life, accepted, respected, to the ghetto of Vienna. And there the father was unable to earn a living. And from that moment on, they had poverty.
The one hope in this new, diminished life was their gifted son Sigmund. But his future presented a dilemma. Jacob Freud wanted to maintain his son's religious heritage, yet he also wanted him to succeed in the secular world outside the ghetto.
His father hired a tutor, and that tutor gave him some rudimentary lessons in biblical Hebrew so he could read prayers. In retrospect, he sees this as a kind of a part of his secularization, because the man who teaches him, a man named Hammerschlag, is in point of fact a secular Jew. And Freud becomes a great friend of the family as he grows up.
A spark from the same fire which animated the spirit of the great Jewish seers and prophets burned in Hammerschlag. Religious instruction served him as a way of educating the young toward love of the humanities. He made Jewish history flow out far beyond the limitations of nationalism or dogma.
Sigmund easily won admission to secondary school. There, he would enter a whole new life.
The second half of the 19th century is distinguished by the war between science and religion. That was not always the case. Newton was a deeply religious man. Kepler said, "I think your thoughts, O God."
The more and more natural phenomena were explained in a scientific way rather than supernaturally, the more religion felt threatened. And I heard one clergyman say that belief in miracles began to subside with the invention of the electric light bulb. That let there be light.
The new teaching captivated his imagination.
I felt an overpowering need to understand something of the riddles of the world in which we live, and perhaps even to contribute something to their solution. I came to know all the fields of science, but to which of them would I choose to dedicate my life?
Clive Staples Lewis tells us his own life story with a purpose. His is a journey toward belief in God. He was born in 1898, 42 years after Freud. He grew up in Belfast, Northern Ireland. His grandfather was a Protestant minister. His father, Albert, a lawyer. His mother, Flora, was a mathematician.
In 1907, they moved into Little Lee, which Albert had built for his wife. And there they were a very happy family. I think Flora knew her son better than the father did. She gave him a good foundation in Latin and in French and in English.
When he was 5, Louis told his family that he would no longer answer to the name of Clive. They were to call him Jack.
I am a product of empty, sunlit rooms, indoor silences, attics explored in solitude. Here, my first stories were written and illustrated.
Afternoon, boys.
They were an attempt to combine my two chief literary pleasures, dressed animals and knights in armor.
Jack and his older brother Warren spent all their time together, playmates and companions. Together, they made a magical private world.
Once, in those very early days, my brother Warren brought into the nursery a box which he had covered with moss and garnished with twigs and flowers. That was the first beauty I ever knew. It made me aware of nature as something cool, dewy, fresh, exuberant. Everything seems like a dream. Anything seems possible. And all sorts of ideas float through your mind. It was something quite different from ordinary life and even from ordinary pleasure. Something, as they would now say, in another dimension. It was a sensation of desire. But before I knew what I desired, the desire was gone. The world turned commonplace again.
Throughout his life, Louis would often remember the feeling aroused in him by the toy garden. He named that feeling joy.
There's a pang of desire that this garden brings back, as though he once was someplace which is now beyond his reach. It's lost to him, and he wants desperately to return to that.
I must now turn to a great loss that befell our family when my mother became ill. There were voices and comings and goings all over the house. Our whole existence changed into something alien and menacing. As the house became full of strange smells and midnight noises. I remembered what I'd been taught, that prayers offered in faith would be granted. I set myself to produce by willpower a firm belief that my prayers for her recovery would be successful. The thing hadn't worked. With my mother's death, all settled happiness, all that was tranquil and reliable, disappeared from my life. And there has never been, really, any sense of security and snugness since. I've not quite succeeded in growing up on that point. There is still too much of Mummy's lost little boy about me. My father's good qualities, as well as his weaknesses, incapacitated him for the task of bringing up two noisy and mischievous schoolboys.
Albert was distraught. Now, we all know that if possible, the survivor needs to be strong for the children. But in this case, I think the children were simply partly devastated by the fact that not only had their mother died, but their father was falling apart in front of them.
One day, my brother made a tent. He used a dust sheet from the attic and a stepladder taken from the house and turned into tent poles. My father came home from work. Then the lightning flashed and the thunder roared. He said he would close the house and we should be sent away to America. Being still a boy, I believed in these threats. I would awake at night, and if I did not immediately hear my brother's breathing from the neighboring bed, I often suspected my father and he had secretly risen while I slept and gone off to America, that I was finally abandoned. No more of the old security. It was sea and islands now. The great continent had sunk like Atlantis.
The most heart-wrenching episode in all of Lewis's literature, I think, happens in The Magician's Nephew, when the little boy picks the apple that Aslan sent him for and knows that his mother lies dying at home in England and realizes that this magic apple could cure her. And the witch says, take it, take just a slice of it. The lion will never know, and it will cure your mother. But the little boy Diggory doesn't do it. He brings it back to Aslan and is so surprised when Aslan gives him a piece and says, take it back. Well, the little boy takes the apple back to his dying mother and gives it to her. And we see the middle-aged C.S. Lewis writing in his book of fantasy what he couldn't achieve in life.
Jack Lewis was sent to boarding school in England. He had lost his mother and been abandoned by his father and the faith that had failed him.
What I would like to ask is, how much was early family influences for you a role in accepting or rejecting a specific worldview? How much did reason play a role in it? Is it possible that we all experience what Lewis calls joy, these periodic, extraordinarily intense feelings of longing for something or someone, and mistake it for something else, for having the perfect career, or winning the Nobel Prize, or having the perfect marriage? Do you think that this is universal? Have you experienced it?
I certainly think there's a universal human drive for wholeness, for internal unity and unity with the universe. I think it's a religious instinct, if we can call it that way, not an organized religious instinct.
Well, how much did that play a role in your own worldview?
I think I was encouraged as a child to take stock of all the experiences I was having, not just intellectual ones. So I think I was sort of raised to understand that I could make decisions based on things that were not intellectual. So that started the worldview. But as I have grown up, it's deepened my sense that we all have an organic drive towards the other, capital O. I mean, we're born into it. We're born as relational creatures. The first things we do is we look at our mom's faces. We won't survive if we're not in relationship. And I think that's part of how we manifest this religious instinct, this instinct for the other, that we are not sufficient unto ourselves as creatures and as beings.
Are you saying that everyone has this instinctive drive for a relationship with the Creator?
I think so. I would say, I would put it, yeah. Yes, I would.
Has anyone else experienced anything in their lives that might be categorized by this description that Lewis gives?
Ever since I've been a little girl, I've had very powerful experiences of God's presence. And on the other hand, when I went to college, by Thanksgiving of my freshman year at the University of Pennsylvania, I came home and told my parents I was an atheist because I had just encountered the scientific worldview, and I said, whoopee, that's great. I don't have to believe all that stuff. And then at a certain point, I began to do Buddhist meditation because Buddhism is a non-theistic religion. And ironically, by just sitting, trying to keep an empty mind on my cushion, I found myself back in contact with God. And had I not done this practice from another faith, I wouldn't have had this experience that I could trust as an authentic experience, because it wasn't some priest or minister telling me what to believe. It was just me on my cushion, alone in a room. I decided to recognize that what I was experiencing was not an empty mind, but the divine presence.
The greatest moments that I've experienced spirituality has been seeing people who make that life commitment to sort of break the momentum of living in a capitalist society, who say, okay, I'm going to try to create order in this society. I'm going to use my life to try to create peace. That's the transformative moment for me. It's not in churches for me. It's not. It's an active engagement in the world.
I agree with you. I mean, in the practice of medicine, one-on-one with a patient in a relationship that is so utterly unique, you know, it's so rare that one has that degree of concentration in dialogue with another human being. And I find in even the small sort of illnesses all the way to the end-of-life situations, they're all very spiritual experiences.
I agree that giving yourself to others is uplifting and actually may make you happier than if you live only for yourself. And I believe that people experience connectedness to the world and to others and have these transcendent emotions. But does that say anything about the existence of the supernatural, or is that just a phenomenon that we as human beings experience?
See, I think, Jeremy, it's that notion that we really have the spark of the divine. Every person you meet, whatever culture, background, when you take the time to listen to the stories, you see where God has, the hound of heaven, has really been after that person or has touched that person. And they've never had a chance to share it because they would not even call themselves religious. And
yeah, but this hound of heaven, the small voice, the spark, these are words trying to describe something.
Well, that's part of the journey, trying to put inadequate wording to something that's so majestic and so unbelievable. It's just hard to know how to...
Here's a problem. I'll tell you what troubles me about this conversation about it, because I feel like I'm getting lost a bit, is, number one, to the extent that people do have these religious or spiritual experiences, whether you call it an oceanic feeling or transcendent experience or some sense of connectedness, it's not clear, even if you label it spiritual, where that gets you.
For me, the scientific worldview generates that kind of feeling of transcendence. An early experience, I suppose, would be Carl Sagan's Cosmos. I think Carl, more than anybody else, gave the feeling of the pure, emotional, awe and wonder and joy at the miracle of life, and the cosmos is so big and vast and grains of sand, and we're just one. And it certainly generates in me a feeling of spirituality. I feel like a spiritual person without a belief in God.
Were you agnostic before, or did you have a spiritual worldview and change from that to what you call a scientific? By a scientific worldview, I take it that you mean a secular worldview?
I mean a naturalism is my philosophy, that all phenomena have natural explanations. There is no supernatural. There's just the natural and stuff we can't yet explain. That's basically my position. Socially, when I moved from theism to atheism and science as a worldview, I guess, to be honest, I just liked the people in science and the scientists and their books and just the lifestyle and the way of living. I liked that better than the religious books, the religious people I was hanging out with. Just socially, it just felt more comfortable for me.
A real clear,
no, it was
one day here, one day here?
No, a couple of years with.
So it was a relationship-driven decision?
Not solely. The intellectual stuff and all that's part of it. But if you're going to be honest, it's not just reasoning your way to a position.
Well, how do you make sense of the other now?
In reality, I think most of us arrive at most of our beliefs for non-rational reasons, and then we justify them with these reasons after the fact.
Well, as a psychiatrist, I think that we are primarily beings of feeling more than of thought, and I think that most of our decisions are often are made on the basis of what we feel instinctively. And so I wonder, in all of us, how much of it we are influenced by people that we meet, whom we admire and want to be like.
Freud's mentors were from the new world of science. In the early 1870s, scientists were trespassing on the traditional domain of religion. This rebellion against the established order appealed to the young, ambitious Sigmund Freud.
Freud enters into the university at a point where materialism, the notion that our bodies are collections of chemicals and chemical processes, has been victorious. The body now becomes something mechanical that can be understood through science, through lab science. I mean, this is a world in which realities of the body are at the center, not the metaphysics of the spirit.
The theories of Darwin, which were then of topical interest, strongly attracted me, because they held out hopes of an extraordinary advance in our understanding of the world.
He's a very smart guy, and he's reading the hot philosophers of the late 19th century. He reads Feuerbach, he reads, or at least learns about Nietzsche. They argue that human beings have to be understood as biological entities in the world.
Freud's passion was science. But the material world didn't replace his old love of the humanities. Along with biology and mathematics, he also chose a class on religious belief given by the philosopher Franz Brentano, a former Catholic priest.
Brentano demonstrates the existence of God with as little bias and as much precision as another might argue the advantage of the wave over the emission theory.
Franz Brentano is one of the cult figures at the university when Freud is studying. He's a guy who has this kind of charisma that we associate with the great teacher. Brentano's philosophy is, in point of fact, a kind of a throwback philosophy. It's a philosophy that is, to be simplistic about it, romantic in its attempt to tie up every aspect of the universe.
I hope that, in the end, you will all be more persuaded that a casual study of philosophy leads us away from God, but to delve more deeply into it is to be led back to Him again.
I have not escaped from his influence.
I am not capable of refuting the simple theistic argument that constitutes the crown of his deliberations. Indeed, I am making a thorough study of his philosophy. Meanwhile, I reserve judgment as to the question of theism and materialism.
Freud, not only with Brentano, but with others, and especially within himself, contemplated and reflected upon the whole question of the proof of the existence of God, or the converse, disproving the existence of God. He came to the conclusion that it was not possible to definitively prove or disprove God's existence because it is not really a scientific question.
Faced with the material world and the spiritual, Freud made his choice.
I found rest and satisfaction in the physiological laboratory of the great Ernst Brücke. For 6 years, through painstaking study, I learned the importance of observation in science. This was the foundation of everything.
Through the end of the century, there are all sorts of major discoveries about the mechanics of the nervous system, and Freud is right in the middle of that. Freud's a neurologist. He learns how nerves work. When Freud goes off and studies the nervous systems of primitive animals, he's doing cutting-edge work.
But his years in pure research ended in disappointment.
My teacher strongly advised me, in view of my bad financial position, to abandon my theoretical career. I followed his advice, left the laboratory and entered the general hospital, where I became a junior resident.
Freud is establishing himself as a physician. He wants to be a professor, but this is really difficult. He's going to have to establish himself, but as somebody who's going to have a practice dealing with sick people. So on the one hand, he's got this professional moment, and this is the moment when young men decide they're going to get married.
Freud had met Martha Bernays, a young woman from a distinguished and deeply religious Jewish family, and they fell in love.
If today were to be my last on earth, and someone asked me how I had fared, he would be told, I haven't been happy simply because of the anticipation of one day having you to myself, and of the certainty that you love me.
Freud worked hard to save money while he courted Martha. They waited for 4 years. But when they finally married, Freud would not allow Martha to practice her faith in their household.
Freud sees himself as Jewish, not religiously as Jewish, but ethnically as Jewish, and he wants to have someone who is compatible to that construction. The trade-off is that in their home, after the marriage, ritual is simply not practiced.
Freud's rejection of religious belief was not just a rejection of Judaism. It was a rejection of what he considered to be a belief in the supernatural, in magic and mysticism, which he regarded as something quite apart from being realistic.
Science asserts that there are no sources of knowledge of the universe other than carefully scrutinized observations, in other words, what we call research. And alongside it, no knowledge derived from revelation, intuition, or inspiration.
The scientific method, Freud writes, is our only source of knowledge. The 10 Commandments, according to Freud, come from human experience, not from revelation. Would contemporary science agree with this? Is the scientific method incompatible with the concept of revelation?
I mean, there's all sorts of philosophical schools, but one of the ones that seems to certainly make the most sense in a sort of common sense way is that, there is a truth with a capital T, that certainly that's true in the way we do science. We operate with the assumption that things work together in a coherent, unified way. And analysis of the situation of the question of God is whether or not, the first step, does he exist or doesn't he? And
the data are lacking.
Right. But I'm troubled by the idea. I'm troubled by the idea that one can be willing to believe in something if it's not true.
But just because it's not scientific doesn't mean it's not true. If reality is sitting in the middle of the table and we all are looking through a different window and a wall around the table, to me, science is just one of those windows looking there, and I can go over there and see a window, the art window, I can see the religion window, I can see the music window of reality. It's just, I don't understand why science in our age, by some people, is regarded as sort of the be-all and end-all of reality.
Well, I'm one of those.
I know,
and the reason is because there's an actual method to find out whether it's real or not. At least
but
approach
according to who?
Materially
What is real?
But it's the only common objective standard. I mean, I can't quarrel with you if you say that you experience love or religion. That's your experience. The question is, I think, for me anyway, in terms of organized religion, to what extent can somebody claim that their beliefs are true and that your beliefs are false?
Right. Well, that's a real,
True for you or true for all? And if you want to say true for all, there has to be a common standard for evaluating those claims. Take a hypothesis or a theory, apply it to the facts. If the data doesn't fit the theory, you either have to discount the data and somehow explain it away, or you've got to modify your theory. And that's how science works.
But I think this is the problem. We keep making this be the criteria for understanding. If we can understand it, it's one thing. If we can't, it's another. And we keep making these enemies of each other.
But there's no other way to understand.
Yes, there is.
No,
there are tons of other ways to understand. It's not rational. But rational understanding is only one way of understanding. And we have become such slaves in the West, and certainly in this country, to intellectual cognition is only one way of understanding. No. When you hold a child, you are understanding things about that creature that you're not using your cognition for. I think statistic that people have come up with, and from various points of view, is that we're 1/4 conscious and 3/4 unconscious at all times. And that both are functioning together in tandem with self-knowledge, without self-knowledge.
Isn't unconscious just another part of the brain that's operating? It's not some mystical force.
We're not just brains. No, it's not a mystical force, but it's unconscious. We can't know it in the same way.
But we know it in a different way, a different naturalistic way. It's all natural.
Give us the answer.
I think the tricky part of this discussion and the sort of the pink elephant in the middle of the table that we're not talking about is really going to come down to experience.
Yes.
And it's a very difficult thing to talk about with people who don't accept religious experience as being a real thing.
And that's the problem I think some people have with religion. If someone says, I've had a religious experience and I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and rose from the dead, I can't quarrel with whether or not someone actually believes that. Perhaps they do. The question is whether I should believe it as well, and whether or not the coercive power of the church or the state should be brought to bear to get me to believe that same thing, or whether my life would be better for it.
When he went to boarding school, C.S. Lewis reacted against what he felt was a disappointing and dull religious faith.
The fussy, time-wasting botheration of it all. Hymns were extremely disagreeable to me. Of all musical instruments, I liked the organ least. Christianity was mainly associated, for me, with ugly architecture, ugly music, and bad poetry. School life was almost wholly dominated by the social struggle, to get on, to arrive, The rivalry was fierce, the prizes glittering, the hell of failure severe. I came to hate school. I never ceased by letter or by word of mouth to beg my father that I might be taken away.
At last, when Jack turned 16, Albert, his father, agreed to take him out of school to study with a private tutor. His name was William Kirkpatrick, called the Great Knock by his students.
If ever a man came close to being a purely logical entity, that man was the Great Knock. He had been a Presbyterian and was now an atheist.
I suppose familiar with Gowan's... The Great Knock had been Albert Lewis's tutor, had been Warren Lewis's tutor, was a very severe logician. You know, Lewis records his first meeting with the Great Knock and an attempt to make small talk. So he said something like, it's a nice day. And the Great Knock said, what do you mean by nice? And on what grounds do you attribute those qualities to this day? And Lewis realized that this is not a man to make small talk with.
He was the very man who taught me to think. A hard, satirical atheist. A man as honest as daylight. His attitude to Christianity was, for me, the beginning of adult thinking. The impression I got was that religion in general, though utterly false, was a natural growth, a kind of endemic nonsense into which humanity tended to blunder.
In 1914, the First World War engulfed Europe. Three years later, at the age of 17, Lewis won a coveted scholarship to Oxford University. But before his freshman year was over, he decided to enlist in the British Army. Among his classmates going to the battlefront was his friend Paddy Moore.
Lewis was a visitor to the Moore home and was received like a member of the family. And so they swore to each other the following: if one of them died and the other lived in the war, the survivor would take care of the dead comrade's family.
The war was a kind of crusade to the youth of Europe. They were convinced that the enemy were demons. They were convinced that theirs was a cause worth dying for. And 9 million did.
I have gone to sleep marching, and woken again and found myself still marching. The frights, the cold, the smell of high explosive, the landscape of sheer earth without a blade of grass, the horribly smashed men still moving like half-crushed beetles.
Lewis was on intimate terms with pain. He was wounded in World War I. He saw the sergeant who had saved his life blown up next to him. In other words, he knew, as that generation did, the horrors of the Great War.
He thought God was at fault for causing the suffering he saw in the First World War. That was God's fault. He shouldn't have allowed that to happen. He thought he was a blackguard. That is the way he described God in his own poetry.
14th of May, 1918. Paddy has been missing for over a month and is almost certainly dead. Of all my own particular set at Oxford, he has been the first to go. And it is a bitter irony to remember that he was always certain that he would come through.
After the war, Lewis returned to Oxford. Good to his word, he set up house with his dead comrades' mother and sister, Janie and Maureen Moore.
She was mother surrogate, she was a companion, and of course she was a comfort to him as well. I mean, there was this household, it was home for Lewis. home, this idea of home. This matters very much.
The early loss of my mother, great unhappiness at school, and the shadow of the last war, and presently the experience of it, had given me a very pessimistic view of existence. My atheism was based on it.
Life experience turned Lewis away from faith in God, but Freud believed that his atheism was the result of an intellectual process. To the young Viennese neurologist, religion could not explain the complexity of the human condition. This problem led him to the most critical insight of his life and his work.
Freud gets a fellowship to go to Paris, and he's going to go to Paris to work on neurological diseases of children with the man who is the world's greatest expert, a man named Jean-Martin Charcot. Charcot is working with hysterics. That is, people who have physical symptoms that don't seem to have a physical cause.
What Charcot demonstrated to Freud was that he could induce symptoms through hypnosis that mimicked and mimed the same symptoms the hysterics showed without hypnosis. So he could induce paralysis, convulsions, blindness, and it made Freud realize there were mental processes that go on very significantly outside of conscious awareness.
He puzzled about hypnosis. How is it that I can affect a human being's mind without his consciousness? What goes on here? That there's a powerful influence without the knowledge and the cognition of the patient.
Freud returned to Vienna convinced that neurotics could be treated with hypnosis. Then he went a step further. Through experimentation, he found he could get the same result simply by letting his patients speak in free association. No one had tried that before.
It's important to understand that Freud is trained as a materialist neurologist. A neurologist deals with people who are ill, who come into the office and say, I am not feeling well. And the doctor says to them, where does it hurt? And they go, it hurts right here. The psychiatrist at this point is running asylums. He is not dealing with individual patients. He is dealing with mentally ill people as a group. The psychiatrist doesn't talk to their patients because they assume they're crazy. They can't communicate.
By listening carefully to patients, Freud uncovered forbidden, often sexual feelings that the patient had repressed, which then made them sick. This discovery was so threatening to Freud's professional colleagues that they completely rejected him.
Word was given out to abandon me, for a void is forming all around me. This year, for the first time, my consulting room is empty. For weeks on end, I see no new faces, cannot begin any new treatments.
Deeply in debt, Freud struggled to support his family and his aging parents, who had never recovered from the failure of his father's business. But on Freud's 35th birthday, his father gave him the cherished family Bible.
Jacob Freud gave the Bible to him with a most moving dedication, composed into a very particular way of petitioning Freud to return to the Torah.
My dear son, in the 7th year of your life, the Spirit of the Lord began to move you and said to you, go read in my book that I have written, and there will be open to you the sources of wisdom, of knowledge and understanding. You have looked upon the face of the Almighty, have heard and striven to climb upwards, and you flew upon the wings of the Holy Spirit.
Each sentence had a profound biblical meaning and, at the same time, a profound personal meaning for his son to whom he was addressing the dedication.
For the day on which you have completed your 35th year, I offer it to you for a remembrance and a memorial of love from your Father, who loves you with unending love. Jakob Freud.
He invited him to use the book again and to get the richness from the book, but Freud could not do it.
5 years later, Jacob Freud's long life came to an end.
The old man's death affected me deeply. I valued him highly, and he meant a great deal in my life. By the time he died, his life had long been over, but at death, the whole past stirs within one.
The death of his father was a nodal point in further launching Freud toward an introspective examination of his own internal feelings. It left him somewhat depressed, somewhat anxious, but also in a very analytic frame of mind.
In my inner self, the whole past had been reawakened by this event. I now feel quite uprooted. There is still very little happening to me externally, but internally, something very interesting. I am led to my own dreams. As I fall asleep, involuntary ideas emerge, fermenting and simmering in me. Masses of bristling riddles lie round about. They lead me through all the events of my childhood.
Since Freud primarily wanted to be the explorer of the unconscious, he raised the question, how can I get access to it? What are opening windows to take a look into the unconscious mechanisms? And then he said, dreams. Dreams, while I'm not conscious, my brain produces a variety of images, pictures, and stories beyond my consciousness. So it must be within the unconscious. So the dream gives me access to the function of the unconscious.
The founder of psychoanalysis turned his new technique on himself. For 4 years, he carefully analyzed his own dreams, with startling results.
My libido toward my mother was awakened on the occasion of a journey during which we must have spent the night together, and there must have been the opportunity of seeing her nude. In my own case, I discovered that I was in love with my mother, and now consider it a universal event in early childhood.
Through his dream work, he recalled a scene with his father that revealed his childhood admiration and disappointment in this powerful figure.
My father began to take me with him on his walks and revealed to me his views on the world. One time he related to me a story that left a profound impression on my life, though not the one that he had hoped. He said he wanted to tell me how much better things for the Jews were now than before. Then he told me, "When I was a young man, I went for a walk in the streets of your birthplace. I had a new fur cap on my head. a Christian came up to me and knocked off my cap into the mud and shouted, "Jew, get off the pavement." I asked my father what he had done. He said, "I went into the roadway and picked up my cap." This struck me as unheroic conduct on the part of the big, strong man who was holding the little boy by the hand.
The self-analysis revealed to Freud that he harbored ambivalent feelings toward his father. The feelings he had been aware of, respect, even veneration, love, admiration, coexisted with opposite feelings. They coexisted with feelings of disillusionment, disappointment, anger, resentment, and hostility. The hostility went so far as to include unconscious, before analysis, Freud was not aware of this, unconscious death wishes. He then began to understand that he also viewed his father as a rival for his mother's love. And that would lead us directly to Freud's analysis of the myth of Oedipus.
It is the fate of all of us to direct our first sexual impulse towards our mother and our first murderous wish against our father. Oedipus shows us the fulfillment of our own childhood wishes.
In that myth, Oedipus unwittingly, unknowingly, meaning unconsciously in our terms, marries his mother and kills his father.
With the Oedipus complex, Freud theorized that people have their own internal mythology, created from their earliest childhood experiences. He thought that religious beliefs were merely projections of our own fears and desires.
The child's attitude to the father is colored by a particular ambivalence. The father himself constitutes a danger for the child, perhaps because of its earlier relation to its mother. Therefore, it fears him no less than it longs for him and admires him. The indications of this ambivalence in the attitude toward the father are deeply imprinted in every religion.
What Freud saw was that our Father who art in heaven and our Mother who art in heaven were the idealized parents of childhood. So the Heavenly Father, the Divine Mother, for Freud became the king and queen of fairy tales.
God was the exalted Father, and the longing for the Father is the root of the need for religion.
Is it possible that Freud's atheism and the atheism that Lewis embraced for the first half of his life can all be explained in part on the basis of early negative feelings toward their fathers? A considerable amount of evidence supports this notion. Lewis, like Freud, associated the spiritual worldview with his father, recalling discussions in which the father encouraged him to attend church and become a believer. The question is it possible that our early life experiences, especially our relationships with our fathers, colors our attitude in later life toward this whole concept of an ultimate authority? What do you think from your own observations, from your own personal experience?
I'm curious, why just the father? I mean, why not mother and father, or mother? There's something not entirely intuitive in that.
Freud does mention parental authority, but because the father is often the strongest symbol of that parental authority, he speaks of the father as a heavenly father.
My own father, I juxtapose what you just led us in with my own relation with my father, where he died a rabid atheist. He wanted to remind me on his deathbed that he didn't believe some of the worldview that I had been embracing. Part of that was to be independent from my father's atheism, but part of that was my own journey. There certainly is a dynamic there that I don't fully understand, but I know it was important to me to carve out my own way, and it actually, I haven't fully resolved why I did that. Part of it was the hound of heaven pulling me, and part of that was probably a adolescent rebellion against my father's strong atheism.
So you're saying that this need to be independent from your father, to rebel against what he embraced, to be your own person, was an influence.
Yeah, it might be a unique case because you usually see the other.
That's right.
Is this not also a testable hypothesis? That is, people who believe in God tend to have this kind of relationship with parents, and people that don't believe in God have a different kind of relationship with parents. And I don't think there's any empirical data to support that.
In fact, I think the very important issue that this initial question about the father is that in order to really have a mature spiritual life, you have to move beyond God as the parent in the sky. I think it's almost inevitable that you start out there as a child because that is your model of an authority or a caregiver or providence. But I think if you're really going to become a thinking person of faith, you have to realize that that's a childish vision of God, the best you can do at a certain point, and then you have to move beyond that to something way different than your daddy.
Yes.
And how do you do that?
I think it's a
I mean,
process.
how do you change your image that's formed as a child, influenced by the parental authority?
I think we have a great deal of information now from other spiritual traditions, particularly Buddhism, Hinduism, the African faiths, things that have allowed us to see God or the sacred or ultimate reality, whatever you want to call that thing, from very different perspectives than just the Judeo-Christian monotheistic Godfather. So I think we have a more multidimensional way to look at the issue that these guys were struggling with, which was very Freudian.
Once Freud defines his worldview, he writes that the doctrine that the universe was created by a being resembling a man, but magnified in every respect, a kind of Superman, reflects the gross ignorance of primitive peoples. His main argument rests on the notion that religious ideas are rooted in deep-seated wishes and are therefore illusions, false beliefs. According to Freud, God does not make us in his image. We make God in our image. Now, do any of these arguments make sense today?
Taking Freud's view, I'm a fan of Freud and a fan of his arguments, but just because you wish that something is so doesn't mean that it isn't so. What Freud's saying is that if you look at the data and you want to take the most parsimonious approach to things, come up with the simplest theory, he'd say, well, maybe instead of saying that a God's there, it makes more sense to say that these are universal human wishes, and the best explanation as to why people around the world come up with different conceptions of God is because there's this universal need for explanations, comfort, order in the face of chaos and disorder.
Would you say then that these are feelings, both Lewis and Freud are describing, but they don't have anything to do with the reality of God's existence, with this basic question as to whether or not he does exist?
No, I disagree. Feeling can reflect truth. What if the feeling is put there, the need to be in communion with an ultimate being is there by design? Okay? Then that feeling is a reflection of truth. It's more than just a feeling.
How would you tell whether it was or wasn't?
That's the difficulty.
But you see, the other point is that
there's two ways of looking at or interpreting the wish fulfillment argument that Freud emphasizes. You know, I grew up in a home that was religious. My parents sort of survived the Korean War and came to America as a result of the generosity of American missionaries. Grew up in that environment, didn't have any problem or question anything about religion. I thought it was just the way things were. And then in high school, happened to pick up this thin book called Civilization and Its Discontents. And I was horrified. I was shocked. I mean, here in the space of 90 pages, Freud undid my entire reasons for believing.
How old were you then, Fred? 17?
14.
14. Precocious.
Yeah. And, and I think, that whole idea that, all right, it's only true because I wish it to be true, to me at the time was terrifying, that this could be the case. But the flip side, which I didn't think about for quite some time, was, well, maybe I wish it to be true because the ultimate authority placed that need or that wish within me. He wanted his creatures to seek him.
In 1922, Jack Lewis took his degree in classics and philosophy from Oxford University. At the time, reason and logic dominated academic thinking.
Lewis describes the new psychology of Freud, which made a tremendous impact upon undergraduates, particularly somebody like Lewis, whose life was so imaginative.
The new psychology was at that time sweeping through us all. We were all influenced. We were all concerned about fantasy or wishful thinking. I formed the resolution of always judging and acting with the greatest good sense.
He was saying that all youth at that time were trying to escape from wish fulfillment dreams. They got that from Freud. And they wanted to, in one way, spit on the images of their youth and go on to they knew not what, but anyway leave that behind because it was juvenile.
Lewis was writing a long poem called Dimer. In it, he portrayed belief in God as a tempting illusion, one that had to be resisted. But he found that in his own life, he wasn't so certain. The question of God's existence would not let him go.
I was, at that time, living like many atheists in a world of contradictions. I maintained that God did not exist. I was also very angry with God for not existing. I was equally angry with him for creating a world. Why should creatures have the burden of existence forced on them without their consent?
More than anything, Lewis wanted to write poetry, and for that he needed the security of an academic career. He applied for teaching jobs at Oxford, but college after college turned him down.
I was attacked by a series of gloomy thoughts about professional and literary failure. Such a rage against poverty and fear and all the infernal net I seemed to be in, that I went out and mowed the lawn and cursed all the gods for half an hour.
Lewis's first ambition, a burning ambition from the age of about 15, was to be a poet, a great poet.
I could not say simply that I desired not my fame, but that of the poem, nor was the feeling a disinterested love for Dimer simply as a poem. It was a desire that something that I recognized as my own should publicly be found good.
His hopes were finally fulfilled in 1925. Magdalen College made him a fellow. The next year, he found a publisher for his long poem, Dimer. Success at last. But it was not enough.
All the books were beginning to turn against me. Indeed, I must have been as blind as a bat not to have seen long before the ludicrous contradiction between my theory of life and my actual experiences as a reader. The most religious were clearly those on whom I could really feed.
The poetry he really cared about was not Ezra Pound and Gertrude Stein. All these years, the greatest pleasure he ever had was from Christian poetry. Things like Spencer, Milton, all of these great poets. And yet he found out that he was reading them, as he later said, with the point left out. The same thing was happening with his friends. The people he thought he should have liked were the college atheists. But the ones he really liked were Tolkien, a practicing, very devout Catholic. Owen Barfield, who asked all the right questions.
I can only describe it as the Great War between Barfield and me. When I set out to correct his heresies, I find that he had decided to correct mine. And then we went at it, hammer and tongs, far into the night. Night after night.
Barfield believed that the imagination plays a very important part in how we know. He rejected the model that science is the only way to truth, to acquiring truth. He felt that the imagination lay behind even the work of science. It gave meaning to propositions. And so he felt that Lewis was missing out in his whole approach to reality on what made knowledge possible.
I was suddenly compelled to read the Hippolytus of Euripides. O God, bring me to the sea's end, to the Hesperides, sisters of evening, who sing alone in their islands where the golden apples grow. And a lord of oceans guards the way from all who would sail into their night blue harbors. Let me escape to the rim of the world, where the tremendous firmament meets the earth, and Atlas holds the universe in his palms. For there, in the palace of Zeus, wells of ambrosia pour through the chambers, while the sacred earth lavishes life, and time adds his years only to heaven's happiness. I was off once more into the land of longing. My heart at once broken and exalted as it had never been since the old days. I was overwhelmed. I called it joy.
When Lewis talks about joy, he talks about something that he labels the central theme of his whole life. But what he means by joy is not the satisfaction of a desire, but a desire that is more desirable than any satisfaction.
There was no doubt joy was a desire. But a desire is turned not to itself, but to an object. I had been wrong in supposing